Story number 1. I'm currently a 20-year-old female and a pre-med student / wannabe author. To get a full grasp on what happened to me, you will need some information about the setting that it took place in, and the situation. When I was in about 2nd grade, I went to an old, pretty poor school in northern Illinois that had a gigantic wooden playground built before it lost most of its funding. You know the types of playgrounds that make white suburban soccer moms go into conniptions, with its exposed wood, ripe with splinters, thousands of wasps' nests, tiny hidden areas underneath the main scaffolding, and rusty nails and chains galore. Needless to say, we kids loved it, and even the high schoolers would come and play on the massive structure when the little ones weren't there. There were always kids of all ages there at all times. What made this playground even better was a large, thicketed area that the local kids collectively called the brush. It was an expanse of low, dense shrubbery that had grown into an unmanageable bramble that instantly swallowed anyone who was able to crawl inside. Over the years, a maze of little hobbit-sized trails had been worn into the brush, from children crawling in and out and breaking off branches to create miniature clearings and alcoves to hold secret club meetings and play jungle. The brush was absolutely impenetrable to all but the most determined and flexible adults, and made us kids feel like big shit when we managed to sneak past the recess aides and dive into it. Unfortunately for the rookie teachers and aides, they were usually the ones sentenced to go fetch little pricks like us when we snuck in and refused to come out. At the time, I thought the only reason the adults were so determined to keep us out of the brush was simply the fact that we could hide in there and sneak around. I was too young to understand what the weird plunger things and white floppy tubes were at the deepest part of the brush. I soon found out, however, that syringes and used condoms weren't the only thing I should have been afraid of. Now, even more backstory. In 2nd grade, I was lucky enough to live right across the street from the big wooden playground and the thicket. Our house was an ugly brown 2-story with a small lawn. At the front of the lawn, we had a tree I climbed all the time, and a tire swing that I played on constantly. Our neighborhood was full of older people and young families, and very quiet. So during the summer months, my mom and dad would take the dog, as well as my little brother and I, on walks around the neighborhood after dinner. Probably to tire us out so we would go the fuck to sleep. On the last 2 blocks of our circuit around the neighborhood, I would always ask my mom and dad if I could run ahead and play on the tire swing while they slowly strolled around the corner and made their way back. They usually agreed to this only if they could see me in the yard from where they were walking, and I would sprint down the road as fast as my shrimpy little legs could carry me, and play on the swing for about 5 to 10 minutes until they made it up the driveway and to the front door. One day, I must have been extra hyper and obnoxious when I asked my parents to let me run ahead and play on the swing. Even though we had much farther to go than usual, they let me go ahead. As we were behind the corner where you would turn to go down our street, I cut across a couple neighbors' lawns to get to our front yard and started playing away. I hadn't been in our front yard very long when I heard a man's voice call "hey" a couple times. I looked over to see a man in a white shirt and cargo pants in the front edge of the brush. He was still behind some of the shorter shrubs, and had obviously popped out of the thicket. I wasn't used to grown-ass men trying to talk to me, and paused on the swing to look at him, pretty confused. "Hey," he said, looking up and down the street. "Hey, do you want to come play with me?" He didn't come closer, staying behind the small shrubs, and his shoulders were hunched in a way that made it look like he was trying to fold in on himself. Now, I was a pretty stupid little kid, but stranger danger was being pushed pretty damn hard in the schools and in the community at the time, so even I knew this behavior was absolutely inappropriate and weird for someone who appeared to be 30 and hiding in the bushes in front of my house. Nevertheless, I tried to be polite and called back, "No thank you, I'm okay," to the stranger. I'd stopped playing at this point, and stood on top of the tire swing staring at the man who hadn't budged. I was a very sociable kid, and liked people. I was known for running up to people I didn't know and striking up conversations with them, much to the terror and worry of my parents. However, something about this guy made me uneasy. I was only 8, but this was the first time that a man made me feel scared, for a reason that I wouldn't have words for until I was much older. I didn't want to go near him. I didn't want him to see me, and I wanted my family to hurry up and come home. but they were still about a block from turning the corner to our street. The man shuffled behind the shrubs and looked behind him and to the left, then turned back to me. "Please," he begged, balling his hands up and pulling them up to his chest in a bastardization of what young toddlers do when they don't get their way. "Please come over here and play. We'll have a lot of fun." He looked fitfully up and down the street as soon as he finished saying this, moving jerkily and visibly more nervous. I had had enough, and my stranger danger sirens were blaring at full blast. Our house was locked up since we were out, and I couldn't get inside. I remember a distinct feeling of wanting to be out of reach, not just farther away. I wanted to be somewhere where this man could not get to me, no matter how hard he tried. Without any more hesitation, I scrambled up the knotted rope of the tire swing up into the tree. Once I reached the first branch, I called out to the man and said, "My mom and dad say I can't play with strangers, I'm sorry," then scrambled up a couple more branches. "Besides, they're coming home soon and I have to go to bed." The man became more fidgety. "Where are your mommy and daddy?" he asked. "It's okay to come play for just a little bit." I didn't answer, concentrating on climbing higher. I was now at a pretty significant height in the tree, and at a level where the branches would have snapped under anything heavier than a tiny 8-year-old girl. I looked back at the man, now at a vantage point where I had a bird's eye view of him and his surroundings, and saw something that made me go into silent hysterics. Behind the man in white was another man. They were about the same age, but this man was dressed in a khaki green shirt and brown pants and crouched behind the same bush that the man in white had popped up from, only now visible from my new vantage point. I remember the scene so clearly. The man in green was in a stance like a football player ready to tackle, or a baseball player ready to catch a low ball. But what made me so absolutely frightened was the fact that he was holding a large cream-colored pillowcase with both hands. I knew these were bad, bad men, and they wanted to take me away from my family and my home. I was close to a screaming, crying meltdown, and told the man in white again that I wasn't going to play with him. I remember my throat was tight, and I was looking around for any adult I knew, in hopes that I could tell them what was happening. To my absolute relief, I saw my mom, dad, little brother, and our pitbull mix round the corner and begin to head down our street, right towards me and the creeps. I pointed with my skinny, pasty little arm and began telling the man in white that my family was coming now, right now, and that we were going to go inside. The man didn't believe me and continued to try to coerce me to come down and play in the same way he had before, only with more looking behind and to the side at the crouching man. Finally, the man in white spotted my family about 3 blocks away and jumped, obviously kicking into panic mode. "Please, you have to come here," he begged, taking half a step forward in the brush. The crouching man said something that made the man in white stop, and he looked desperately back at me. They both looked at my approaching family, then silently ducked into the bushes, clambering into the thicket where I couldn't see them anymore. When my parents were close enough, I clambered down and immediately tried to tell them what happened. Unfortunately, though, since I was a little bitty thing, I've had the weird reaction of hysterically giggling and laughing when I'm scared out of my freaking mind. It's an absolutely horrible reflex and makes me look like a psycho to this day. Since I was laughing like a crazy person and jumping around with nervous energy, my parents assumed my story was some sort of weird story about an imaginary friend. I had a lot of those. Or I was talking about a cartoon I saw earlier. I tried insisting it was real that night and the next day, but my parents refused to believe me and told me to hush or I'd get in trouble. My parents rarely believed me when I told them things, and still don't to this day. I put the incident away in my mind from that point on, and never saw the 2 men again, nor heard about them from anyone. However, about 2 years later, the brush was torn up and the remnants were burned to the ground by the school, with no explanation given to the kids. My family moved away from that house when I was in 5th grade, then moved out of the state when I was in 7th. When I was 16, and our family was eating dinner together, something prompted me to tell the story again. My parents stopped eating and looked at each other in horror. My mother quietly asked me if I was seriously telling the truth. I exasperatedly assured them that I was, and jokingly said I was pretty close to ending up on a milk carton. I regret saying that, because I could see both my parents' faces turn white, and they realized, fully, how close they had been to losing their only daughter all those years ago. So, creepy men in the brush, let's not meet again. Story number 2. Back in 2010, I had moved into my first apartment alone. Before that, I had always lived with at least 2 or more people, so I was pretty excited to finally have my own apartment all to myself. I didn't live in a particularly bad complex, and it was a decent-sized 1-bedroom. In this complex, we tended to get a lot of people going door to door selling stuff. Knives, things from catalogs, magazines, stuff like that. I always brushed them off because it usually seemed shady, and I really hate door-to-door salesmen. Well, one morning around 9, I was getting ready to go to work and I heard a knock on my door. It was some guy selling magazines. He launched right into it and told me that he gets dropped off by his leader and walks around the city to different complexes and homes selling these magazines. If he sold a certain amount, he got to take some trip or something. He was probably like 5'9", normal build, and had kind of greasy looking blonde hair. He was probably like 5'9", normal build, and had kind of greasy looking blonde hair. Like the bright ass blonde hair some people have. He was very charismatic and seemed like a nice guy, but I told him I wasn't interested. He pushed and showed me the kinds they offered, and there were a couple I did actually like to read, and I could get them at a discount if I signed up, which means he suckered me into this shit. What can I say? The guy was nice, he was around my age, and seemed pretty genuine. Why not help him out and get discounted magazines? So I let him in, and we proceeded to fill out some paperwork and all that jazz. He made small talk with me and asked my age and how long I've had my ferrets and stuff like that. We ended up talking for about a half an hour, and I told him I had to leave for work. So he got his stuff, said thanks, and left. At this point, I was a server in a chain restaurant, and I was working a double that day. A couple hours later, I got off and came home. Just when I had gotten changed and sat down, there was a knock on my door. It was that magazine dude from earlier. I thought he may have forgotten something, or maybe the paperwork hadn't gotten finished, so I opened the door. He said hi, and I asked him if he'd forgotten something, and he said, "No, I just enjoyed talking to you, and I've gotten my quota for the day, so I figured I'd see if you were home and I wanted to hang out while I wait for my leader to come get me. Is that okay?" It was a little weird, but I figured it couldn't hurt. I mean, I've got neighbors above and beside me, and across from my door, so why not? I felt pretty safe. I did tell him I was working a split that day, so he couldn't stay long. He ended up hanging out the whole 2 hours I had off, and he left when I left for work. While he was there, we talked about life in general, and I asked about his job. He traveled for it, and said he and his group were only here in town for about a week, then they go somewhere else to sell the magazines. I thought it sounded pretty cool. He started to confide in me a little that he was tired of it and wanted to have a normal job and other stuff I can't really remember. I told him if he feels that way, he should just quit and go home. We got off on another subject after that, but I figured that was the last I would see of him. That night at work, I got a text from an out-of-state number that I didn't know. All it said was, "Hey," smiley face. So I replied back, "Who is this?" It was that fucking magazine guy. At first, I wondered how in the fuck he got my number, but then I remembered that paperwork had asked for it. I kept cool about it, but at this point, I'm officially weirded out that this stranger is getting in contact with me so much after not even really talking a lot, or for that fact, not even really knowing me. I asked what was up, and he asked what I was doing. I told him working, because that's why I had to leave earlier. I guess he thought I was lying, because he asked why I was at work so late. It was around 11:30 p.m. to 12 a.m. I told him it was because I closed tonight. He said, "Oh, well, I'm just chilling in my hotel room." I put my phone away and got back to work. I didn't care what he was doing, and I didn't care to talk to him anymore. I finished work, got off, and went home. As I walked up to my door at the apartment, my neighbor was sitting outside with her husband on their porch. We weren't close, but we were friendly. I say hi, and she asked me if I knew some blonde guy. I said, "No, why?" She told me some guy with blonde hair came by knocking on my door while they were outside earlier, and he asked if they knew when I'd be home. It was that fucking magazine guy again. I told her how he'd come back earlier, and if they see him again, don't ever let him know that I'm home. Her husband says he'll keep a watch and make sure the guy goes away if they ever see him again. I thank them and head inside. I'm pretty weirded out at this point, but I try to just let it go. There's no way he'll try to come back again, and I can avoid him for what few days he has left here if he does try to come back. I assumed he wouldn't though, because, what kind of weirdo does that shit? So the next day I didn't have to go into work until like 5 p.m. so I sat around and hung out all day and did some cleaning. It was a Friday night and we usually got pretty busy at work. I had a mild drinking problem at this time. I was 20, so I say mild because I was just a kid that liked to drink a lot. So before I would go into work on weekends, I would have a couple drinks beforehand. Not to get drunk, but I would be a lot more social and outgoing or fun with customers. It's around 3 p.m. if I remember right, and I'm in the middle of my drink and feeling pretty good when someone knocks on my door. I forget the worries of yesterday and just waltz over and open that bitch up, not looking through my people at all. Guess who? Motherfucking Blondie. Of course, in my slightly tipsy state, I'm all like, "Hey, what's up?" He tells me he got dropped off at the complex across the road and wasn't having much luck, so he figured he'd stop by and hang out with me again. Fuck it. Come on in. Why the hell not? We have a couple drinks together and talk for a couple of hours again, and he keeps talking about quitting his job and getting a normal life and all that. It's then I start to wonder why he keeps calling it a normal life, and why he calls the group leader a sponsor sometimes. He starts telling me how cool I am, and how he wishes he could meet more girls like me. He says he likes the city I live in a lot, and the people seem nice. Just a bunch of stuff like that. I started feeling kind of weird around him, because he kept sitting closer to me, and seemed to be getting more flirty. At this point, I decided I was done with this dude, and I wasn't answering the door for him anymore. I told him I had to get to work and to have a good night. In reality, I didn't have to be at work for another good half hour or more, but I just wanted him away from me and out of my apartment. Work goes great, I made mad tips, came home with no incident, and neighbors didn't say anything to me. The next day, I'm out running some errands, and I get a text from Blondie again. He sent me like 5 or 6 in a row, asking where I'm at and to open my door because he's outside, how he just left his job like I told him to, and he needs a place to think about things, and how he knows I'm inside because he can hear me. First of all, I'm like, what the fuck? But second of all, I never told him to quit his job. I suggested that shit, and never offered to be his fallback plan. I tell him I'm not home and to leave. He says he can hear me inside and knows I'm lying. He was hearing my ferrets in their pen most likely. No one was ever in my apartment. He's pretty much freaking out on me over text and saying that he wants to move in with me and start a new life here in my city. He doesn't have the money to fly home, and he barely has money for food. He starts calling me over and over again and leaves voicemails and keeps texting me. He finally says he'll just wait on me to get home and we can talk about it. No? I kept telling him he completely misunderstood me and he needs to go back to his job. I don't want him around, and I don't even know him. I was just being friendly when he wanted to chat. I didn't want him to full-blown move in with me. As I'm getting all these messages and stuff, I'm driving to a sporting goods store. I don't have the money for a gun, and really at that point didn't even know how to go about buying one, and definitely didn't know how to use one. But I did know how to swing a bat. I played softball for 6 years. I can swing a damn bat, so I bought a damn bat. I was shaking when I put it in the back seat of my car, still getting texts from him. I stopped reading them at this point because I was getting too upset and I didn't even know how to reply to or deal with someone like this. I didn't want to go home yet because I was afraid he was there, but I didn't have anyone to call to help me. I drove up to the park and sat for about an hour and finally decided to go home. He wasn't there, but my neighbor's husband was outside when I got there. He said the guy had basically been beating on my door for almost an hour, and they threatened to call the cops, which I guess is what finally made him leave. I thanked him and went inside. After that, I never heard from him again. I don't know what the fuck was wrong with that guy, but he had some serious problems. I kept that baseball bat next to my front door from then on, and it's next to my front door even now.